Well, hey, thanks for joining us this evening, guys. Appreciate seeing you all here for the first in what I hope will be a few of this format in our lecture series. Let me just give you a little bit of background on me, because you might be wondering who I am, why I want to do this, and I also want to give you a little bit of an explanation as to why we're hosting a lecture series in the first place, and why we want to promote more of this. In Southeast Minneapolis in particular, that's for sure on our heart. So what do we want to accomplish? So my name is Jeremy Deck. I've been a pastor in the northwest suburbs of Minneapolis for about the last 12 years. So my wife and I moved up here in 2006. And I worked at a church in the northwest suburbs for about 10 of those years. The last 18 months, I've been working with a team of people to plant a new church, as Patrick said, just in this western residential of the Marcy area of the Marcy Homes neighborhoods across 35W, really targeting some of the long-term residents, young professionals that live in the Marcy Homes neighborhood out of a desire to start spiritual conversations with people. So, I mean, one of the reasons that we want to start this church is because we believe new churches always give new opportunities to talk with people about Jesus Christ and what I believe to be the truth behind Christian belief. And I think this is important, and I'm excited and passionate about it. And one of the central points of vision behind the church that we're planting is that we want to meaningfully and relationally engage even the most skeptical people in Minneapolis. Okay, we want to start conversations, right? We want to open up further conversation and dialogue with people who have very, very different beliefs from us. We want to provide a context in which people can disagree about serious things and even be friends while they talk about the serious things that they disagree on. Not something that I think is common in our current political climate or just even the way that we communicate generally, but I think that it can be achieved. Even when we talk passionately about the things that we disagree on, there can be community and friendship, truly. And so if we're able to start more conversation about spiritual things in this neighborhood and surrounding neighborhoods in Minneapolis, like, we're pretty happy about that. That's a big part of a lot of the things that we want to do at Gospel Life Church, and we invite that with all of you who are here as well, and we're super thankful to Bob and to be in partnership with you guys at Jacob as well here tonight. So outside of that, what are we hoping to accomplish, maybe more specifically, with this lecture series? Well, one natural part of being a church that desires for even the most skeptical people to find community by way of relationships, but also a challenge to the way in which we think. One natural part of that is the need to be patient, understanding, and helpful in the midst of people's doubts. And outside of just being in a relationship with people who have doubts, like a skeptic isn't just, I think when we hear the word skeptic, oftentimes we assume that means non-believing person, but there are a lot of believers who are skeptical about the claims of Christianity and that have doubts, right? So we want to be helpful in the midst of that. And one of the ways, certainly, that you're helpful is just being in a relationship and telling a person who has doubts that, listen, this is okay and it's natural and it's normal in the Christian life to experience doubt. You can probably plan on experiencing doubt at some point in your Christian journey as it relates to different aspects of the Christian life. But another way that we help people that's just as important is addressing the source of those doubts, so that the doubting Christian can be further encouraged and established in their faith. So we don't want to just sit with people in their doubts and just say, hey, just allow this to continue to weigh on your shoulders. I don't think that's a loving way to approach doubt either, right? So it's not how Jesus approaches doubting Thomas. He approaches him patiently. He invites him into a relationship, but he challenges his doubt too. And I think that's an aspect of this that we want to accomplish. Another natural part of being a church that desires to meaningfully and relationally engage skeptics is then addressing some of the skepticism of non-believing people, right? So what I've come to find over the course of working with students, from high school into college and into young adulthood, the workforce, for the past 12 years, is that the concerns of skeptics, I'm telling you, I think this is true, the concerns of skeptics and the doubts of believers are usually pretty closely tied together. They're usually orbiting around the same kinds of central concerns, right? Because we all live in the same time and space. So what we want to do through this series is address, each time we host one of these, one area of Christian life and thought each month that people normally form some kind of an objection around or have some kind of a problem with as it relates to Christian theism, right? Belief in God, but a belief in the Christian God. And here's our statement for tonight. And I should say before I read this statement, I just want to make sure you know this is the case. This doesn't belong to me. It's not unique to me. It doesn't belong to Gospel Life Church or Jacob's Well at all. It's an old statement used in the 1970s by, it's a quote, old statement used by InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in order to stir conversation on college campuses. It's been referred to quite often in recent years by author and pastor Tim Keller in downtown Manhattan, but it reads this way. The resurrection of Jesus, it's on the screens, the resurrection of Jesus is intellectually credible and existentially satisfying. So why did we choose this for tonight in our first time out of the gate in this lecture series? Well, 3 reasons. Okay, so this is Monday. It's the Monday of what Christians call Holy Week, in which we remember and uniquely celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus for us. And so we thought tonight might be particularly interesting for Christians and non-Christians during Holy Week, particularly timely for us to take a look at the claims of the resurrection together. That's interesting, I think. We also decided to do this, number 2, because this is the claim upon which every other claim that Christianity makes is based. Okay? If Jesus is raised from the dead, then everything that Jesus said and did and taught, including pointing backward to the Old Testament and pointing forward to the authority of the apostles and the authoring and closing of the canon of Scripture, all that's validated. If he's standing there physically, bodily risen, then we can say he gets to call the shots about things, and his revelation about himself to us is then to be trusted, right? It can be trusted. So before we even get to objections about things that I hope to get to, right, like evil and suffering, absolutism in the Christian life, eternal punishment, eternal life, whatever other objections might be voiced about Christian theism, dealing with its most central claim first seems wise to me, because if Jesus is standing there risen, certainly what we can say is it sheds a new light on some of these other things that we want to talk about. Finally, we arrived at the statement number 3 for our first lecture simply because of the wisdom that we see in this statement and the way that it's phrased. So the resurrection of Jesus is intellectually credible and existentially satisfying. Why do I see wisdom in the way that that is phrased? Well, here's the thing. I've come to find over the course of the last many years that you can't really have a conversation with either a non-believing skeptic, or it's very difficult to have a conversation with either a non-believing skeptic of Christianity or a doubting believer. You can't really have a conversation about the existentially satisfying reality of the gospel. Don't let this word existential throw you. It's not a theological term. It's not a Christian term. It's a philosophical term that simply means like as it relates to the human existence. So the resurrection of Jesus is satisfying in the human life. It's deeply satisfying. Oftentimes you can't have a conversation about how deeply satisfying it is for our existence without first dealing with some of its perceived intellectual roadblocks, like some of the things that get in the way. And it's not just this issue that's the case for. I think it's a lot of issues around which we have doubt. So just by way of example, okay, so over the course of the past 12 years, I've established extremely close friendships, for 12 years with non-believing people in the most atheistic country in the world, the Czech Republic, in which there's no Christian influence at all. Right? So there's no presuppositions that are built on any kind of Western Christian thought in Czech. It is truly secular. And oftentimes when I'm talking with either an atheistic friend in Czech, and increasingly so, people who I've met here in Southeast, I'll hear something like this. And I remember the guy who said this to me the first time. I remember where I was, remember what we were doing. We were in the Czech. One of my friends, still a friend to this day, he said this. He said, well, sure, the resurrection sounds great, but I can't just make myself believe that, right? So he said something like this. I don't remember exactly what, but it was something like this. He said, I mean, for those who are clever and quick, it might sound like great news that a leprechaun leaves a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, right? It might sound like great news if you're able to get there. But I don't believe that at all. It's a legend. There's no basis for it. don't just force myself to believe things that sound good. And let me just validate that. That's a really good point, and it's an important point. I'm not advocating tonight or any night the idea that you should just believe something because it sounds good. And in fact, can I offer the possibility that that's probably part of the bigger problem in our current cultural situation? We keep hitching our wagons to dying horses because those dying horses sound good to us. It's one of the reasons why we love hearing what oftentimes surrounding culture tells us to be true, because it sounds good to us. They sound like they promise us an expedient and adventurous journey, but instead offer us it's a dead horse. So I'm not advocating that. But in order to get to the point where we can talk about this, so in order to get there, this point where we can talk about the satisfying reality of the resurrection, that it gives great meaning in life and hope and peace to the human existence, to the human heart, we need then to first address the perception that many people have that it's intellectually suspect, or that it's on the same level as believing a fairy tale, or that the earth is flat, right? I don't think that's true at all. So the statement that we're unpacking together is actually our outline for our time together tonight. Over the course of the next few minutes, I want to deal with the intellectual, historical side of the resurrection a little bit. My purpose there is not going to be to prove it to you the way that someone would prove something mathematically or using symbolic logic. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I just want to demonstrate that belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus is actually intellectually credible, that you're on solid footing for believing it. I kind of want to get it out of the way as a roadblock. And more than that, I want to argue that the bodily resurrection of Jesus isn't just, I want to echo the voices of guys like N.T. Wright, who would say that it's not just a possibility historically, but actually when you examine the evidence, it's a high probability on the pages of history, to the point where there is no good reason to reject it on historical grounds if one is following the evidence to where it leads, okay? So after that, we'll spend some of our closing minutes. I'm going to spend most of my time on that front end, okay? Because I can't just do that in a handful of minutes. But after that, we'll spend some of our closing minutes giving three primary ways that the resurrection gives satisfaction to the human life. I'm going to have to skip over a bunch of stuff. I'm hoping that some of that can come out in the Q&A. Our time's not going to be exhaustive. We've got 30 minutes here, but we'll do a Q&A. If you think of questions, write them down. I'm certain that I'm not going to have answers for all of them. This is the first time we've kind of hosted any kind of a Q&A after I've spoken at an event. So if you have a question that comes up, write it down and ask. I do have resources that I'd like to point you to the degree that I'm not able to answer your questions. But I'm looking forward to your response. I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about this, honestly. Okay, so the first part. Let's look at the resurrection of Jesus is intellectually credible. A little under 2,000 years ago, something happened in Palestine that would change the course of history, change the world forever. And that event in history brought about first hundreds and then thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people who called themselves Christians. It all happened very, 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 very quickly. You have to understand. It's estimated that by AD 100, just 65 or so years after 6 decades passing after this historical event had taken place, there were 1 million Christians in the Roman Empire alone. Today there are 2.3 billion people on the planet who call themselves Christian. That's unbelievable to me, right? And none of it would have happened without this event that skyrocketed the Christian faith, right? None of those things transpire without some kind of an event that gives it momentum on the front end. So, by way of example, did you guys know? My daughter was telling me this. My daughter's 9 years old. But it only takes the space shuttle about 8.5 minutes to reach outer space. I googled it to make sure. Okay, so it only takes the space shuttle about 8.5 minutes to reach outer space. And that's incredible when you think about the space shuttle itself is a 4.5 million pound system that has to go from 0 miles per hour while it's on the platform to then finally reaching its final orbital velocity of, are you ready for this? I didn't believe it when I first heard it. It was like $2 taps at the poorhouse. Finally reaching its orbital velocity of 17,500 miles per hour. Can you imagine going that fast? It's incredible. So, you might ask, how does that happen? How do you go from 0 to 17,500 miles an hour? Well, it's because of the intensity of the event that transpired in the first 8.5 minutes, right? And in the same way we could ask, how did Christianity go from a group of 12 guys in the Judean wilderness to 2.3 billion people around the world? It's because of the intensity of the events that transpired at about this time, a little under 2,000 years ago. So, what caused this rapid growth of Christianity? Well, it was caused, most historians, and all historians recognize this, it's caused by a belief in the first century that began to spread among first century Jews and Greeks alike. And this is the belief, all right? So, that this Jesus of Nazareth, this figure on the pages of history, was bodily raised from the dead. It's the claim, they believed the claim, that Jesus of Nazareth was bodily raised from the dead. This claim was believed by all of the early Christians for whom we have evidence. That's important. All of the early Christians for whom we have evidence believed in this. This claim was at the center of the way in which they lived, the center of their storytelling. It was the foundation of their faith, the foundation of their recognition that Jesus is Messiah and Lord. It's the reason that they called him those names. The reason why they saw him as the one whom all the Old Testament pointed forward to. It was the basis for their insistence that God had not only sent the Messiah in Jesus, but that he had actually inaugurated a new kingdom for his people to live in, with new kingdom norms and values that would now govern our lives. It changed everything. And above all else, it became their transformative hope that their own future bodily resurrection from the dead would happen some day in the future. So the question that we need to ask tonight as we unpack this moment in history, then, second question, is this. So then, what caused this belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus? Right, so if that's the reason that Christianity exploded in the first century, then what caused people to be so certain that this is what happened? How did that belief come about? What were the conditions in history that created such an enormous amount of people in such a small amount of time? During a time in which the eyewitnesses were still alive in Jerusalem, during a time in which it literally benefited you nothing and came at great cost in terms of interaction with people around you. It came at great cost, even the cost of one's life. How does one in that situation affirm this belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus? Well, let me just answer that by I just want to combine a couple of arguments tonight. So what you're going to hear from me tonight isn't me, right? I haven't spent any time, I've been theologically trained, certainly, but I'm not a scholar trained for scholarly work who, has dove into this. But I've read those who have, and I've come to be convinced, and probably two of the most noted historians and scholars who put serious pen to paper on this issue would be the British New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, who I've mentioned already, and the American analytic philosopher William Lane Craig, both of whom have extensive scholarly training in historical research. And these two men have been persuaded in the midst of their research, along with countless other historians, right? It's not just these two guys. I'm just putting forward their arguments tonight, but there are many others that I wish we had time for. In the midst of their research, they've come to see that the best explanation for the early belief by Christians that Jesus was bodily raised and the subsequent explosion of that belief in the first century by Christians was, in fact, that their testimony was true, that Jesus actually was bodily raised from the dead on the pages of history. So, how do historians come to be persuaded by this conclusion on historical grounds? Okay, let's not start where there's disagreement. So we can fast forward to resurrection, but if we fast forward to resurrection, we're starting at a point of contention. Let's back up and start where everyone seems to agree. Where most historians, whether they're believers or not believers in Jesus. So what most people are actually surprised to learn is that the majority of scholarship, whether that's Christian or non-Christian scholarship, affirms at least what N.T. Wright calls two basic facts about the events surrounding Jesus' death. Okay, so there's two basic facts. William Lane Craig, I think, is going to rightly say, if you hold to these two facts, there's actually two more that you're assuming. There's two more that come with it. There's two more that are implied in them. But let's just start with these two. And it's this: the empty tomb The fact that there was an empty tomb discovered by the followers of Jesus. All right? And what we'll call tonight the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. In other words, Jesus appearing to his followers, two groups of people, after his death. Right? Now, I don't want to simply tell you that this is the case. Most scholars agree with these two things without also explaining why, because I actually want you to believe me. That's a value of mine. So here's N.T. Wright's 6-part argument that demonstrates, I think pretty cogently, why most scholars, as he says, these are his words, and he's a very moderate voice. He's very reasonable. If you were to read his massive volume, The Resurrection of the Son of God, and by the way, this comes directly out of chapter 18. I've modified it somewhat, but I want you to hear N.T. Wright's argument and not Jeremy Deck's tonight, because I think this is the best form in many ways of the argument. So here's his 6-part argument out of Resurrection of the Son of God, which if you read, you'd see how measured and careful, and yet bold he is with his claims because he thinks the evidence is bold, right? So he is, but he says that, in this work, he says that all the scholarship regard the emptiness of the tomb and the meetings with the risen Jesus as historically secure. He goes on to say, we can go as far as to say they're historically guaranteed. Here's why. All right, let's quickly go through these. Number one, the world of first century Judaism definitely contained the idea of resurrection. So the idea of resurrection was there from within Judaism. But the Christian belief in resurrection was so different. I mean, as you read the New Testament, it's so strikingly different and consistently different that it rules out any possibility that the belief could have generated spontaneously from within its Jewish context. When we ask the early Christians themselves what had occasioned this belief, their answers always home in on two things. So anytime you visit what first century Christians said about why they believed what they believed, their answers home in on two things. Stories about Jesus' tomb being empty, and stories about him appearing to people alive again. Okay, that's the first part of this argument. Number two, I can come back to this in the Q&A, but number two. Neither the empty tomb by itself, however, nor the appearances by themselves could have brought about this early Christian belief. The empty tomb alone would be a puzzle and a tragedy, Wright says. And this is interesting to me, because if you open up the Bible and you open it up to the gospel according to John's gospel, John's account, the followers of Jesus discover the empty tomb, and they're not rejoicing. They're not jumping up, and Peter's not rejoicing. He's frightened. Mary's not rejoicing. She's weeping, not out of joy, because she thinks somebody stole the body. And when she finally does run into Jesus, she's pretty sure it's the gardener, right? According to the biblical account. Why? She's not expecting to see someone risen from the dead. Okay? So the empty tomb alone would be a puzzle and a tragedy. Sightings of an apparently alive Jesus by themselves would have been classified as visions or hallucination, after all, because he's still in the tomb, right? So you could see a vision of Jesus, but if his body is still lying in the tomb in which he was buried, you're going to know, okay, he's not bodily risen from the dead. And by the way, N.T. Wright claims, these visions and hallucinations are well documented. They're well enough known in the ancient world for that to have clearly been the way in which those would have been categorized. So, number three then. However, an empty tomb and appearances of a living Jesus taken together would have presented a powerful reason for the emergence of belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. These two things taken together give followers of Jesus coming to an empty tomb. There's no body. And then coming to experience multiple times in various circumstances, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes in groups, a Jesus that walks with them, that lets them touch him, that eats with them, right? Presents, as Wright says, I think he's right, a powerful reason for the emergence of this early belief. Number four, the meaning of resurrection, so we'll get back to this. The meaning of resurrection within first century Judaism makes it impossible to conceive of this reshaped resurrection belief emerging unless what? Without it being known that, number one, a body had disappeared and that the person had been discovered to be thoroughly alive again. So at the very least, his believers thought this was the case. Number five, the other explanations, N.T. Wright says, and we'll come back to this, the other explanations sometimes offered for the emergence of this belief do not possess the same explanatory power as the empty tomb and the postmortem appearances. Okay, that has the greatest explanatory power. And this is why, and this is N.T. Wright's words, right? So this is why most historians, most scholars today would say it's very historically highly probable that Jesus' tomb was indeed empty on the third day after his execution, and that the disciples did indeed encounter him giving every appearance of being well and truly alive. So that this gives us some background to Wright's claim that the majority of scholarship, and he would know, actually, and we'll see examples, okay, actually believe that this is the case, that his followers experienced an empty tomb and they experienced something that they believed was the bodily raised Jesus. It's widely believed. But that brings us to a seventh point. So I told you it's a six-part argument, but actually there is a seventh part. Wright says this. He says, this leaves us with the last and most important question. What explanation can be given for these two phenomena? Is there an alternative to the explanation given by early Christians themselves, or is the best explanation of this data simply to believe their testimony? Is that the best way to deal with it? Well, this is where we now look to the work of William Lane Craig, among others, right? So this isn't just unique to him. Richard Swinburne of Oxford makes a similar, Richard Bauckham. There are a lot of scholars who make this argument, but Craig, I think, makes it really well. Craig affirms, along with N.T. Wright, that the resurrection of Jesus is the central point of the Christian religion. And that he describes the historian's task as being that of like a trial lawyer. That's kind of the imagery that Craig ascribes to historians, which most historians would agree with, that their job is to examine the testimony of credible witnesses in order to reconstruct the most probable course of events. And so what explanation, as Craig sees it, can be given for the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances? Well, like I said, so if you believe in these two facts, Craig would say you're assuming two more. And he's right. Okay, so now I want to show you why. So here's a quote from Craig directly. He says, any adequate historical hypothesis about the resurrection must explain four established facts. Number one, Jesus' burial. Okay, so if you're holding to the fact that there was a tomb that was empty, obviously you're holding implicitly to a burial, right, of some kind. So number one, Jesus' burial. Number two, discovery of his empty tomb. Number three, his post-mortem appearances. And number four, the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Okay, the best explanation of these four facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. That fourth one, by the way, isn't contested by anyone, but the majority of scholars hold to all four. But let's look at these in detail, right? So that you have, again, let's lay some foundation so we can understand why this is the case. Fact number one, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in the tomb. Now this is actually I hope you're able to see the significance here. What this means for early Christians is that the location of Jesus' body was known. It was a known location. And the reason this is so significant is because it would have been utterly impossible for early Christians to be running around Jerusalem yelling resurrection in the first century if there was a body in a known location. Because, Jewish authorities, Roman authorities could have just gone and gotten the body and said, here's your Messiah, dead, right? So it would have made it impossible, but nevertheless, this fact has been established by the majority of scholarship because of the following evidence. Number one, his burial is attested in very old information handed on by Paul in his letter to the Corinthians. So if you go to, I was going to read it. If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, you'll see that Paul clearly says Jesus was buried. This is about 20 years after the death of Jesus, and yet this very early on is a part of Christian tradition. Number two, the burial is a part of very old source material used by Mark in writing his gospel. By the way, that same source material was utilized by Matthew and Luke, and if you have questions about what I mean by that, you can ask me later. Number three, as a member of the Jewish court, this is interesting, that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is very unlikely to be a Christian invention. And what Craig means by this, and most scholars would come to this conclusion, what he means by this is, if during the time of the eyewitnesses, you're going to invent a character, you wouldn't choose a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, a very important person who you could go and verify. Not to mention, if you were going to invent a member of the Sanhedrin, you likely wouldn't invent, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Raymond Brown in his 2-volume work on the death of Jesus says it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for someone to invent a character of the Sanhedrin who was like a buddy to Jesus, who was a friend of his, the way that Joseph of Arimathea became, because it runs counter to the way that the Gospels talk about the Sanhedrin and the message of what the Gospels are trying to convey about the Sanhedrin. So, number four, the burial story itself doesn't contain any evidence of legendary development. It's simple. Finally, no other competing burial story exists from within early Christian belief. You don't find a competing burial story there, and this is why, John A.T. Robinson, among others, Cambridge University, writes this. He says, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. This is why we arrive at these conclusions. Fact number 2. On the Sunday following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his woman followers. So several reasons have brought most scholars to this conclusion. Number 1, the empty tomb, again, is a part of very old source material used in Mark. Ask me later. The story is simple, again, lacks evidence of legendary embellishment. Number 3, the fact that women's testimony was worthless, was all but worthless in first century Palestine, counts in favor of the women's role in discovering the empty tomb. In other words, if you're going to invent a story in the first century that you're hoping people are going to believe that your teacher was risen from the dead, out of whole cloth, you're going to invent this, which has its own problems, right? Because people didn't think of resurrection in these terms. But if you're going to do that, you're not going to choose these women to be those who find Jesus, not during this time in history, not if you want to be believed. And then finally, the earliest Jewish allegation that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body shows that the body was in fact missing from a tomb, and this is what leads. So here we have, okay, this is, if you've watched PBS, he's been on here before, Gaze Over Me, he's a really world-renowned Jewish scholar. He's not a believer in Jesus, but he says this. He says, when every argument has been considered and weighed, the only conclusion acceptable to the historian must be that the opinions of the orthodox, of the liberal sympathizer, of the critical agnostic alike, and even perhaps the disciples themselves, are simply interpretations of what? Of this disconcerting fact, namely that the women who set out to pay their last respects to Jesus and found to their consternation, not a body, but an empty tomb. Empty tomb is an historical fact. Fact number 3. On multiple occasions, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. These experiences led them to believe that he was bodily risen. Okay, this is almost universally acknowledged among historians for the following reasons. Number 1, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances that's quoted in 1 Corinthians. So Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, again, written about 20 years after these events took place. Paul lists Peter. Paul says this, in effect. He says, don't just believe me. Right? Read chapter 15 where he says, this is what happened. Jesus was buried, was killed, was crucified, he was buried, and he rose, and he appeared. Right? And don't just believe me. You can ask Peter, you can ask the 12, and you can ask 500 brethren and James, whom he appeared to. So this is during the time of the eyewitnesses. How is this going to get off the ground if these things are untrue? And again, this is why. So we have Gerd Lüdemann here, a very well-known German scholar who does not affirm the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and yet he says it may be taken. I use those here who haven't affirmed the bodily resurrection of Jesus just to demonstrate that this is just widely believed, right? So it may be taken as historically certain, Lüdemann says, that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So we're all agreed on this. And then fact number 4 just isn't disputed by anyone. The original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite their having every reason not to. You'll hear from like Marcus Borg and Robert Funk that some of the Jesus seminar people that maybe this isn't the case. But this is how the majority of scholarship would say, like, this is what launched Christianity in the first century. This is what made it such a powerful and dynamic force. They believed that Jesus was risen from the dead. They believed that he was bodily risen at all costs, despite them having every reason not to. So Craig here, he wants us to think about the situation that these followers of Jesus found themselves in the first century. So number 1, their leader was dead. Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising Messiah, right? So that's tragic. This is why, like, as you read Luke's account, who says he spoke to eyewitnesses. He tried to get his data as an historian, speaking to eyewitnesses, right? So in Luke's account, you see this road to Emmaus, where Cleopas and his companion what are they doing? They're leaving Jerusalem. Why? Because their leader, their teacher, died. He can't be the Messiah, right? So there's no reason to think that this is what's going to happen. They weren't anticipating resurrection. According to Jewish law, number 2, Jesus' execution as a criminal showed him to be a heretic, a man literally under the curse of God. That had radical implications for then how they would be treated by Jewish authorities. There's a reason why the disciples were hiding in an upper room on the morning of Easter Sunday. Why? Because they were afraid. That's what the text tells us in it. Why were they afraid? Afraid because they're afraid the Jewish authorities are going to come for them in the same way they came for Jesus. Number 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead before the general resurrection at the end of the world. And yet this is the reason that so there was no context for it. There's no reason to believe this. And yet this is the reason that nearly all historians give when asked why and how Christianity spread so fast in the first century. So, okay, these are simply reasons why, on balance, the great majority of scholars affirms these facts. Jesus' burial, the empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, the early Christian belief in Jesus' bodily resurrection that multiplied. Very important. They're historically secure, historically guaranteed, according to N.T. Wright. But to ask Wright's question again, what explanation can be given to account for all of this? Well, so William Lane Craig, like I said, he goes a step further here. He actually points us to a really important work by a guy by the name of C.B. McCullough. He's an historian who wrote a book called Justifying Historical Descriptions, in which he basically says, look, this is the work of the historian. Do you want to know what the historian is trying to do? When a historian has multiple pieces of evidence of something that transpired on the pages of history, and he's trying to put together the pieces, as he develops historical theories for the most likely explanation for those things, this is the rubric that he runs these things through. Six parts. Number 1, does it have explanatory scope? So another way of asking that is, does it explain more of the evidence? Does it cover the most amount of bases of the events that took place, right? Number 2, does it have explanatory power? Does it make the evidence more probable? Does it actually boost it up? Does it demonstrate, wow, yeah, that probably is true? Number 3, is it plausible? Does it fit better with true background beliefs of the time? Number 4, is it ad hoc or contrived? I think this is the major issue facing the vast majority of alternate theories to the resurrection account. Because they all sound so ad hoc. Ad hoc just means, does it require adopting new beliefs or new explanations for which there's absolutely no independent evidence? And that's what you come to find when you deal with some of these other theories, is that clearly we're trying to make things up in order to get things to fit, and across the board we'll see in a minute. It's just not the case. Number 5, is it in accord with accepted beliefs, or does it conflict with accepted beliefs? You might be saying, aha, dead people don't rise. We'll get there. Okay. Number 6, does it far outstrip any rival theory in meeting conditions number 1 through 5? Does it meet conditions 1 through 5 so much better than other theories that there's little chance that one of the other explanations after further investigation will do better in meeting these conclusions? So, Craig takes these. Maybe you can't see them. I should have made these a little bigger. Craig takes these and he goes through one by one and he demonstrates why, on balance, it's not even close. And N.T. Wright has a version of this as well that we've already read through, but this is really helpful. So number 1, it has the theory, okay, the explanation, God raised Jesus from the dead, passes all these tests. So number 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains why the tomb was found empty, why the disciples saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus in the first place, why the Christian faith came into being, right? Like if Jesus was standing there risen, then right, okay, of course. Like that makes sense of the data. It makes sense of the explosion of early Christianity. Okay, number 2, it has great explanatory power. It actually makes those pieces of evidence stronger. So it explains why the body of Jesus wasn't just gone, but it stayed gone, right? Like it was never recovered. It explains why people didn't just see Jesus alive once or twice. They didn't just have what they deemed to be visions or hallucinations. These are accounts where they're actually seeing very physical manifestations of Jesus on a very regular basis, right? So it's propping this up, and so on and so forth. Number 3, it's plausible. Given the historical context of the first century, given the Jewish belief in the resurrection, it makes sense as to why all of a sudden you see this very divergent belief in resurrection within the Christian community that doesn't come even close to looking like what first century Greco-Roman or Jewish people believed about resurrection. And given the historical context of Jesus' own life and claims, the resurrection serves as divine confirmation of those claims, right? He said some crazy things. And all of a sudden the resurrection shows that he wasn't crazy, right? He is who he said he is. It makes good sense of those things. It's plausible. It's not ad hoc or contrived. What I mean to say is it actually follows the evidence to where it leads, right? So it makes sense of the data. You don't need to adopt any other explanations that are out of line with the evidence in order for the resurrection of Jesus to fit with this, except for one, okay? So it does require one additional hypothesis, according to Craig. And he's right. It requires the hypothesis that God exists. And if you believe that it's possible that God does exist, it doesn't even require that, right? If you're one of the many, many people in our cultural context who believes, yeah, that there's some kind of God, well, it doesn't require that of you. But it does require that. Number 5, it's in accord with accepted beliefs. Okay. So again, you might say, no, it's not in accord with accepted beliefs because here we had a dead man coming back to life. Nobody believes that happens. Well, listen. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, does not conflict with that in any way. It doesn't conflict with the accepted belief that people don't rise naturally from the dead. Nobody was expecting that to take place. Right? Nobody in first century Christianity thought that Jesus was going to rise from the dead, or that it was like, oh, somebody rose from the dead, it must be Sunday again. Like, that wasn't how people responded to the resurrection. The Christian accepts the belief that naturally dead people don't rise from the dead as wholeheartedly as they accept the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. And number 6, it far outstrips any of its rival theories in meeting conditions 1 through 5. So down through history, especially in the last 100 years with these so-called quests for the historical Jesus, there have been all sorts of rival theories put forward by scholars. And why have the rival theories been put forward? Well, mostly because they recognize the problem. They recognize the fact that, well, okay, so there is a burial that's pretty well attested. There is an empty tomb, again, pretty well attested. There's post-mortem appearances that are historically certain. And there's this early Christian belief, all of the Christians for whom we have evidence believe that Jesus is bodily raised. Okay? You can't just neutrally reject the hypothesis that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead without also having to say, okay, then what happened? Right? So that's brought about things like the conspiracy theory, a bunch of people conspiring together to steal the body, which explains the empty tomb, certainly, but it doesn't explain the post-mortem appearances. So, I mean, we could do this with each one of these, like the apparent death theory, that Jesus, after being crucified by the people who are better at killing people than anyone else on the planet, the Romans, went into his tomb for 3 days and then woke up. He fainted, and then he woke up and he was strong enough to, he recovered. Okay, and the hallucination theory, that there's just mass hallucination, the mass grave theory, right? So there's a number of these alternative theories, and I have to say, like, such hypotheses like these have just been universally, this is what Craig says, universally rejected by contemporary scholarship, and no naturalistic hypothesis has attracted a great number of scholars. You don't find one that's like a bunch of people are coalescing around, right? Why? Because of these problems. And it's for this reason that N.T. Wright comes to this conclusion, and I didn't make this big enough, but hopefully you can read it. It's this. This is what I'm trying to get across tonight. This is what I'm trying to say. Historical arguments alone cannot force anyone to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. Nobody's arguing that. Nobody's arguing mathematical proof, logic, symbolic logic kind of proof. But historical argument is remarkably good at clearing away the undergrowth behind which skepticism of various sorts have been hiding. The proposal that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead possesses unrivaled power to explain the historical data at the rise, at the heart of early Christianity. Another way of saying that, the resurrection of Jesus is intellectually credible. Another way of saying that. I wish I could show you. Oh, I wish we had time. I wish we could go through the work of Oxford scholars Richard Swinburne, who makes a similar argument to Craig, but has a really interesting slant on it. Richard Bauckham, who wrote this awesome book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I really recommend it. Like Peter Williams, who took Bauckham's work and developed what he calls, you could YouTube this, it's on YouTube, Peter Williams has an hour-long lecture, way more entertaining than me. He's a pretty good-looking guy too. And he took Baucham's work and he developed what he calls new evidences that the Gospels were based on eyewitness accounts. He's British. He speaks really nice, okay? Look it up. Listen to that. You might not agree completely. Listen, here's my point tonight. My point isn't to say, like, if you disagree with Craig or Wright or Baucham, Swinburne, with any of these guys, that you're, like, dumb or that you're being unreasonable. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm simply saying that, like, these guys aren't idiots. Like, they're not dummies. They're scholars who've been trained by scholars for scholarly work, and in pursuing the evidence, this is the conclusion that they've reached. And there's a whole lot of them who've reached this conclusion and put together pretty decent and cogently sounding arguments. So my only point here tonight is not to cast doubt on all of scholarship, but simply to say, or on the parts of scholarship that deny it, but simply to say that it's more reasonable and more credible for you to affirm the bodily resurrection of Jesus than I think oftentimes we think that that's the case. If you're here tonight and you're wondering, am I on solid footing for believing in the resurrection of Jesus historically? Like, we're kind of, Christians can be mocked for that. For believing in something like, oh, this guy 2,000 years ago died and was resurrected, and you kind of believe that now. Oftentimes you can feel like you're lumped into like the flat earth movement or something like that. But I want to say tonight, there's absolutely no reason for you to be intellectually ashamed of your belief in bodily resurrection. And if you're here tonight and you're not convinced, like you're skeptic and you're not convinced, that's totally fine, right? Obviously, and I'm interested in hearing some of your thoughts, and I likely won't have answers to all of your pushback, but I do want to challenge you to do this. I want to challenge you to think about the fact that you can't simply reject the bodily resurrection of Jesus without being, like, in some sense, forced to supply some other explanation. Like, it's not a neutral thing. To reject one worldview is to, by definition, adopt another. So what is it? And I challenge you to not just, like, in an offhanded way say, I don't believe in that. Try to put pen to paper on, well, what is the best explanation of the rise of Christianity in the first century, the explosion of Christianity, these types of facts, and what the way that N.T. Wright and William Lane Craig did with the resurrection, see if it holds up. Like, and pretty soon, here's what I think. I think you'll come to find what many scholars already have, right? That actually you're struggling against the evidence. So, with the knowledge that, at the very least, belief in the resurrection is intellectually credible, that you're on solid, reasonable ground for concluding that. Let's quickly talk about the second part of the statement. The resurrection of Jesus is existentially satisfying. I'm just going to give you one sentence that's in 3 parts. I have 1 page for this, so it's not going to be long. The resurrection of Jesus accomplishes 3 things existentially in the human heart. Number 1, it brings transformation from the past. Number 2, a new and satisfying life in the present. And number 3, an all-encompassing hope for the future. So let's look at each one of these. Number 1, the resurrection brings transformation from the past. So like we said, if Jesus is standing there risen, then he can ask anything of us, right? Like, then what he said about himself and about us is also true. The biblical account of him is trustworthy and true. And so we need to start by asking, what's the beginning of that story? What's the beginning of the biblical account about Jesus? Like, how does that start? Well, a good and perfect God created us to be in relationship with him and to be loved by him and to spread that love here in a good world. But look around. This world is far from good. Oftentimes it appears to be in rapid decline. Why? Because God failed? Well, no. The story tells us it's because of me. I'll take ownership. It's because of me. It's because of you. It's because of us. We rebelled against this good and perfect God, and we decided that we knew better than God about how to be God. We knew better than him, put ourselves on the throne instead of him. We dethroned God. We made ourselves God, and in doing that, and as I look into the world, it just makes sense. Doing that, we instituted all kinds of chaos, all kinds of disorder, all kinds of greed and selfishness, suffering, evil that of course, when you look in the world and somebody's so selfish, so greedy, and it's wreaking havoc on everyone's lives. Why? Because they think they're God, right? They think they're God. They dethroned God. And along with that, because he's perfect, we deserve his perfect judgment. But here's the great news. God loved us too much to sit back, watch us just destroy ourselves, and then pour out as much deserved wrath upon us, which it was It wasn't unjust, it was just what we deserved. Here's what he did. He instead erupted into human history in the person of Jesus Christ in order to make all things new. All things in this world, all broken things new. Beginning with you. Beginning with you. He lived the perfect life that you should have lived but failed to live. He died your death. He took your punishment. He was your substitute. He stood in your place so that you wouldn't have to receive that judgment from God. So that now God can accept you, receive you, make you his own. Why? Not because of you. Not because of anything that you can do. Because what I did created this mess to begin with. Right? I can't do enough good. It's not because of my record or anything I've done, but because of Jesus' record and what he's done. And so belief in him makes this possible. Now you might say, Jeremy, what does this have to do with the resurrection? Okay. We can't, or I think we shouldn't, talk about the resurrection of Jesus without talking about his death. He rose because he had to die. He had to die because his death created the means by which we can now be known by God. All of God's wrath and all of his punishment for sin was poured out, not upon us, but upon him. He gave himself for us willingly, lovingly. Why? So that we could be united with him. Now in this new resurrection life. He rose from the dead, demonstrating that what he did on the cross to deal with this problem of sin in the human heart was true. Now our hearts are changed, our desires are transformed. We no longer want what our former selves wanted. We now want what he wants, what our Savior wants for us. Like his desires are our desires. Our former selves have died with Christ. We, through his resurrection power, have been offered true transformation. Number two, then. So it brings transformation from the past. Number two, it brings new and satisfying life in the present. Jesus, in raising bodily from the dead, didn't simply validate what happened on the cross. It also invited us into a new resurrection life that begins now and goes on for all eternity. For all eternity. I'm crucified with Christ, the Bible tells us. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who now lives in me. This is a foretaste of our future resurrection, as we'll see in a minute, only made possible by the new life that Christ offers us now. We were once dead in our sins. Scriptures tell us we were dead. We had no life. But now God has made us alive in Christ Jesus. He brought us back to life by the power of his resurrection. We were once enemies and strangers of God, but now through Jesus, he's brought us near. God desires to know you, and for you to know him, he desires to have communion with you, to go with you in all of life. How does he do this? Well, number three, he brings an all-encompassing hope for the future. Listen, Jesus' resurrection doesn't just validate what he did on the cross. It doesn't just invite us into a new life that begins right now and goes on forever, but he gives you a picture of your future. In the resurrection, like when you're reading the accounts of the risen Christ, he's giving you a picture of your future hope. Why is that so powerful? Well, believe it or not, like you might be here tonight and you're like, man, my life is either hard or great, but the means by which you use to identify that have to do with your circumstances. Because we tend to think that our circumstances are the most formative thing about us, but they're not. The most formative thing about us is actually what we believe about our future. And that's what ends up shaping everything about the way in which we respond during difficult times. And I've got a couple of examples, but we don't have time. So somebody can ask me about that. Jesus' resurrection gives us a sure hope, right? So that's the point, a certain hope, grounded in history, grounded further still in the very character of God, who desires for us to know with certainty that we will be resurrected. Our body will be resurrected. Do we see that? Like, the God of the Bible doesn't just offer us some consolation prize called heaven. That like, man, I created you as a physical being on this physical planet to enjoy like this physical world. But yeah, that whole thing burned. So now, we'll all escape this up into heaven and we'll leave this earth behind. Like, it's not just some consolation prize, see what's in box number 2 kind of thing. It's actually like we get back the very thing we lost, only it's better. It's recreated into something greater. We actually get back the very thing we lost. And then the problem is that all other things we attempt to gain satisfaction from in that way will always, be found in ourselves, trying to do enough, be enough, create our own reality, create our own path forward. And that always ends up failing us. Why? Because those things will always, they're temporary. We root ourselves. Man, that's part of my story. We root ourselves in temporary things, our jobs, our academic life, our families, our relationships, our enjoyments and pursuits. And here's the thing about all those things. They're fine in their right place. But here's the thing about all those things. They're eventually going to go away. One way or the other, they're eventually going to all end. They're all temporary. So they can make good goods but lousy gods, right? It will all die out. It will all be lost in this world. It will all come to an end at some point for you. But the resurrection of Jesus is powerfully satisfying because it's eternal and nothing can disrupt your future hope if it's found in this God who rose bodily on the pages of history. This would be my appeal to you, okay? Recognize that the resurrection of Jesus, like Patrick said at the front end, just have an open mind about this. Recognize that the resurrection of Jesus just might be. It just might be far more intellectually credible than you've ever considered. Dig. Don't take my word for it. Read. Dig into the evidences. So recognize that it might just be far more intellectually credible than you've ever considered, and recognize further still that the resurrection of Jesus might be far more existentially satisfying than you've ever dared to believe, that you've ever dared to hope. So thanks for listening.